Good morning. The push for sustainability has been strengthened in the midst of the ongoing pandemic, with the Philippines raising its carbon emission reduction target to 75% by 2030, and the United Nations solidifying its goal for carbon neutrality by 2050, among other initiatives. This is expected to influence the components of the Philippine energy grid, where alternative sources such as solar, wind, hydroelectric, biomass, geothermal, and nuclear can take a larger share and generate the country's power within without putting the environment at stake. While renewable sources are beginning to be appreciated for their capability to generate energy in a clean manner, there may be reservations for nuclear despite the similar advantages it has. Nevertheless, and with less radiation than any other major energy resources, nuclear can be good complement how sources across the country and businesses and communities more sustainably. Today, we have invited resource speaker to share their views on this topic, starting with Dr. Carlo A. Arcilla, Director of the Philippine Nuclear Research Institute, or the PNRI. Dr. Arcilla is the Director of the PNRI since 2017. Among his current projects in the Institute include lowering the costs of cancer diagnosis through nuclear medicine, and innovative nuclear applications in agriculture. Dr. Arcilla received the 2019 Gregorio Y. Zara Award for Basic Research for his contributions to resolving sensitive issues on mineral resource development, water management, and developing peaceful applications for nuclear energy in the Philippines. Prior to being PNRI's director for Dr. Arcilla briefly taught at Northeastern Illinois University, then joined the faculty of the University of the Philippines, National Institute of Geological Sciences, and was appointed its director from 2007 to 2015. Dr. Arcilla, you have the floor. Go ahead, Dr. Arcilla. I think you're on mute, sir.
Good. Okay. And let me share again. So, okay. Thank you very much for giving me the chance to talk about nuclear energy and renewables. Uh, the most important thing about nuclear energy and nuclear fuel is that it has a very high energy content for a small volume. For example, a uranium pellet, this size, uh, with only 2% uranium, is equivalent to 1 ton of coal, 120 gallons of oil, and 17,000 feet of cubic feet of natural gas. And this is the most important reason why it is very useful in today's energy. And then it's also a very green source of energy. If you compare the carbon dioxide output of coal, petroleum, nuclear is the lowest even compared to wind and solar. And in fact, the IPCC has said that if there were no nuclear power, the world's carbon dioxide emission would increase by 10%. And of course, the conference is going on now in Scotland. And there is really no way that the targets can be done if nuclear is not included in the mix. And just very, very recently, just last year, research says that nuclear is now renewable because it's now possible to extract uranium from seawater at current prices of uranium. So this means that it's theoretically possible to actually consider nuclear as renewable because there's unlimited supply of uranium from the sea. Although even speaking in terms of sourcing nuclear, it's actually quite easy to source. Most important thing in considering nuclear is the capacity factor or availability. If you compare the availability of a nuclear power plant, it's about 93%. Geothermal is a renewable 74%. But then when we go to wind and solar, it's about 30%. So because the wind doesn't blow all the time, the solar doesn't shine at night. And then, so this is renewables are fantastic, but because of the low capacity factor of them, they need backup sources or very expensive batteries. Sometimes people ask me, why do we even consider nuclear when we have a lot of solar and wind? And my answer to that is solar, why not nuclear to be the backup for solar and wind? And then people are not aware that 1 megawatt of solar requires 1 hectare of flat land, which will mean in the Philippines mostly agricultural lands, and even more so for wind. Now, there are about 440 operating nuclear plants in the world, which supplies 10% of its power, and in the US is about 95 of that. So, considering the safety, this is mentioned before, if nuclear is unsafe, why does America have nearly 100 nuclear power plants supplying 20% of electricity operating close to 60 years? And they're now going to actually license it for another 20 years to 8 years because they've been so reliable and cheap. And here is the energy mix of the Philippines. We're still half coal. And I just mentioned that for some reason that I can't understand, that we are committed to reduce our carbon output by 70%. And most of this coal is imported. Luckily for us, we have geothermal and hydro. But then Malampaya is running out in 5 years. And what's the best option for this? I think the DOE is considering that we will have to go to LNG. And why can't nuclear get into the mix to supply this gap? But the most important reason, in my mind, for considering nuclear is that a median Filipino family uh, with a refrigerator pays about 10% of its monthly income for electricity, which is really, if you look at this metric, it is really unreasonable and then oppressive. I can't find another word for that. And this high electricity cost seems to be the reason that 2 years ago, DOE survey conducted over thousands said 79% of the Philippine population supports nuclear because of the cost. Nuclear is competitive with coal and gas, and at small volume favors energy security. So again, nuclear should not be said as a competition for renewables, but as a help. Now, just an illustration: if the Bataan nuclear power plant were operating, the fuel would last for 18 months. And the cost of the fuel will be $20 million, and all of the fuel will fit inside the jeepney. If the BNPP, on the other hand, were a 620 megawatt coal plant, for the 18 months it were operating, it would require 50 Panamax ships of coal imported. Importation cost is 600 million US dollars. So this alone, this is the strongest reason why we should at least consider nuclear power. And even for the Taipans and for the for the people owning coal plants now, they should consider this. The challenges, of course, is how to integrate nuclear with harmoniously with coal, because the new nuclear build must have electricity powers. And of course, there are stakeholder issues and legislative challenges, and the rapid expansion of the depleted nuclear human resource base. Although for the BNPP, we have at least 3 model plants that are operating right now. So I would stop here and then be open for questions later on. So again, thank you for giving me the chance to make this presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Arcelia. Our next speaker is Mr. Eric T. Francia, President and CEO of AZ Energy. Under Mr. Francia's leadership, Ayala established its energy platform in 2011 to become one of the largest renewable energy platforms in Southeast Asia. With over 2,000 megawatts of attributable renewable capacity, Mr. Francha is also a managing director and member of the management committee of Ayala Corporation since 2009 and was appointed as chairman of Ayala's investment committee in 2021. He is also a director of various Ayala Group companies, including AC Infrastructure, AC Health, AC Venture, and as chairman and CEO of ACE and Exor. Mr. Francia, please go ahead.
Hi, Vic. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Dr. Arcelia and fellow panelist Jay. Looking forward to our spirited discussion later, but let me say a few words. First of all, I think this forum is quite timely, given that it is a good primer for a major event happening in November, which is the COP26 in Glasgow, where the various country leaders will be revisiting and recommitting their climate goals. As you may or may not know, already more than half of the countries globally have already committed to net zero, most of them targeting net zero by 2050, where there will be effectively zero carbon emission, either directly or through limited offsetting. Um, so, so this is a big event in November that Dr. Arcelia referred to earlier, where countries will ratchet up improve their commitments. And as Vic mentioned in the opening remarks, the Philippines has targeted a 75% reduction by 2030. We have not committed to the net zero yet. I think only Singapore has committed to net zero among the Southeast Asian countries. I would be interested to hear more about specific policies and programs on how the Philippines would uh, achieve that 75% reduction by 2030, and be interesting topic to discuss in a bit. On the corporate setting, over 20% of the top 2,000 companies globally have already committed to net zero. In the Philippines, I believe it's only been Globe and Nestle Philippines that have committed to the so-called science-based targets. Now, why am I talking about a net zero? I think it's a very important long-term backdrop or context when we talk about sustainability and sustainable energy, which is the center of this topic. I think one of the key implications of the whole world moving to a net zero uh, path is that significant investments, we're seeing great pools of capital shifting towards sustainable net zero related investments. These are investments in renewable energy, which would be one of the main investment areas. Green hydrogen is already being talked about over the last couple of years. CCS, or the carbon capture technology, electric vehicles as well. So these are the so-called energy transition initiatives and the requisite investments that are going. Large pools of capital. We see this in the green bond market. We see this among ESG investors picking companies that are really focused heavily on ESG and net zero related investing. What this also means on the flip side is less and less investments will be made on the traditional fossil fuel investments. So there will be declining investments, and I think this is one risk that we need to highlight, that over the longer term, the global trade on fossil fuel, which we are still as a country heavily dependent on, are going to be vulnerable. So I think the bottom line here is that we should take a great effort in terms of achieving that energy independence. We are too dependent on the global supply chain when it comes to fossil fuel and so forth. It's not just an environmental issue, it becomes a security issue as well. Let's overlay on top of this global context the decline in Malampaya that was mentioned earlier. I'm sure Jay will also mention that in his piece. Malampaya seemingly has started to decline. There was quite significant restrictions over the past few months. There's also some coal supply constraints that saw coal price more than triple over the last 12 months. It was like $50 per ton, Newcastle price last year. Today, it's about $170. So even in the middle of the pandemic at that. So supply chain shocks can really put a lot of upward pressure on costs, even in the middle of a pandemic. Oil is also very high now. From a negative price once upon a time a year ago, it's now back at the $70 level. So it just goes to show that it's not only an issue on the demand side. The demand might weaken for fossil fuel over the long term, but there's also a supply side constraint that could really put pressure on prices and therefore make countries like Philippines, which is dependent, vulnerable. And then in addition to that, I don't mean to be a doomsayer here, but our coal plants as well are aging and declining in reliability. We've had a lot of forced outages over the last 1 to 2 years and has been putting pressure on the supply side. So bottom line is we do need to level up in terms of harnessing our indigenous resources in the country. I think this will be the subject of a lot of discussion this morning. Renewable energy would be the most obvious choice: solar, wind, hydro, geothermal, and biomass. But while we are very big proponents on renewable energy, we believe that this needs to be complemented by supplementary technologies like battery storage. But battery storage is still expensive at this point in time. It will improve over time, but at this point, it is not enough, or it's not feasible for renewables and storage to be the answer. It will take time to be competitive and to scale up. Our point of view is that over the short to medium term, we still need the transition fuel, and that would be gas would be the most viable transition fuel, given that coal, we already have a moratorium on that, and there's less support on coal from financial institutions in the broader investment world. Now, so gas definitely should be part of the equation in terms of this transition, in addition to the battery storage, which is more of a mid to long term solution. And then over the longer term, much longer term, probably 10 to 20 years time, again, as I mentioned earlier, green hydrogen should be on the table. It would be interesting. We're not very familiar nor focused on nuclear. Happy to hear further thoughts from Dr. Arcilia, but again, there are certain considerations there given the perceived risk of nuclear, and just managing the perception, which makes all these big companies shy away from that technology. There's been a lot of discussion on LNG lately. We're happy to discuss that later in preparation for the Malampaya decline. But then again, it would be great to develop more indigenous resource. We have a lot in the West Philippine Sea. One would hope that we could further harness the potential that we have, not only around Malampaya, but on the rest of the West Philippine Sea area. So in summary, I think the energy transition is upon us. We should really step up in terms of taking this on a more proactive stance. It will take time. It's not going to be overnight. We cannot just switch off all the carbon emitting power plants. It has to be an orderly transition. We need to have a long-term roadmap. Renewables will have a big role to play. Gas will have a transition role, and all of these enabling technologies have to be factored in as they get developed over time. That's it for now, and happy to discuss more details later. Thanks, Vic. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Francia. Our next speaker is Attorney Jose M. Layog Jr., Senior Partner at Puno and Puno Law. Attorney Layog recently served as Chairman of the National Renewable Energy Board from 2016 to 2018. He was an Undersecretary of the Philippine Department of Energy from 2010 to 2012, heading the Renewable Energy Management Bureau, Energy Resources Development Bureau, Energy Utilization Management Bureau, Oil Industry Management Bureau, and Legal Services within the DOE. He was primarily responsible for the revival of various Philippine energy sectors with successful launching of the National Renewable Energy Program, the Philippine Energy Contracting Round for petroleum and coal, and the Public Transport Assistance Program, or Pantawid Pasada. Attorney Layog, you have the floor.
Thank you, Vic. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to Business World for this invite. And of course, it's great to see Vic. It's been a while. It's been 10 years. No? And great to see some old friends in Eric and Doc Caloy. No, again, years ago before I last saw them. I'd like to add to what already Eric and Doc Caloy already mentioned. No? And let me start off with some factual data based on statistics provided by the Department of Energy. If you go to the next slide, you will see for the last 10 years, and you will see the slide, between 2009 to 2020, we have seen all these installed capacities over time. And what does this data show us? Number one, if you look at the years 2010 to 2016, capacity grew by 5,180 for those 6 years in the previous administration. And of those capacities, you will note that 1,500 megawatts came from renewables. So there was a surge, albeit not the number that we had wanted. We wanted a higher capacity, but you would see that from 2010 to 2016, we pushed hard with renewables and 1,500 megawatts were installed. We launched the National Renewable Energy Program in 2011. We also launched the net metering program, the feed-in tariff system, and all these bore fruit, of course, and led to new capacities of renewables of about 1,500. However, between 2016 until today, you will note that your renewables grew only by 650 megawatts. And this was mentioned also by Eric earlier. You will also observe here that more coal plants were actually built. Now, so while we launched the National Renewable Energy Program in 2011, the result was the opposite. While we pushed for 35% new capacities from RE, it became quite the opposite. We had less in the installed capacity in the Philippines of renewables. If you now go to the next slide, you will see also from here that from 2010 to 2016, we had a lot of investments in RE. And then it suddenly had a reduction in terms of investments after that. So as I mentioned, from 2016 to 2020, only about 650 megawatts of RE were put in place. And of those, actually, 350 came from the previous feed-in tariff program that was implemented between 2010 to 2016. So that's the storyline behind the capacity additions. Now let's go to, and if you go to the next slide, in terms of generation, taking into account the capacity factor for renewables versus the other conventional power plants, it has an even worse data set. You will see from here that once upon a time, we are about 30% generating power from renewables. Now we are down to 20%. And if you look at the gray shaded diagram, coal grew by 50%. That was already alluded to by Doc Caloy. So there was a reversal of trend when we had actually push for more RE. Let's go to the next slide. How about supply, demand, no outlook? You will see from the data. Next slide, please. Um, the good thing, although it was a negative effect, it has a negative effect on the Philippine economy. If you go to the next slide, you will see that the pandemic resulted in a reduced demand for power, of course, because all economic activities screeched to a halt. No, so luckily for us, there was a reduction in demand for power, and therefore it somehow prevented a massive brownout. No? But you saw that already this year, that when economy started going back, to its feet, with the lifting of the restrictions, immediately you see there an uptick in demand for power. In fact, in May, peak demand reached 15,000, when our dependable capacity is only about 13,000 megawatts. And then if you go to the next slide, of course, you will see over time, and this is data from the DOE, there is a demand for power because we are a growing economy at around 4% annual average growth in demand. We need more power. We need more additional capacity. So we've seen the demand data and the supply. Now, if you go to the next slide, the next question is, do we have a problem? No? And I've said this many times, Houston, we have a big problem. Why? If you see the next slide, you will see here that once upon a time, we were energy self-sufficient because we were utilizing more RE and therefore not importing coal or importing not so much coal and oil at 65% in 2009. But 11 years or 10 years later, we're now down to 46% in terms of self-sufficiency. We had relied more on imported coal and oil. We have a problem in that because, as we know, conventional fuel and fossil fuels will deplete over time. And of course, if countries will not allow exports, particularly out of Indonesia for coal, then we will have a problem. We will always be vulnerable to price shocks. If you go also to the next slide, and this was alluded to also by both Doc Caloy and Eric, you will see that as early as 2019, there was a surge in average outage of power plants. Why? As mentioned earlier by Eric, if you look at the data of capacities current in the Philippines, about 35% of the capacity, so that's around more than 6,000 megawatts, are 20 years old and older power plants. And for that reason, now we see more outages. Average every year about 2,600 megawatts. That's not good for us, especially if our dependable capacity is only just around the peak demand. So Houston, we do have a lot of problems. And if you go to the next slide, you will see the aging of plants, and their place in the energy mix. And we all know, if you go to the next slide, that there is always an inverse relationship between supply and price. The more supply we have, the lower the price. So the less supply we have, we should anticipate higher electricity prices. That's what's going on right now. Whenever power plants go down. And in fact, as mentioned earlier, Malampaya will go out very soon. So we have a problem. Now, how do we solve this problem? Next slide. How do we push for more renewables? I've listed 5 items here. Let's pursue some energy transition reforms. Foremost of which, we should declare that renewables should be the preferred energy resource, not a technology-neutral policy. Next, let's allow more DUs and electric cooperatives to conduct their competitive selection process more easily and not wait for a long approval time. That has resulted in delays. Number 3, let's create a one-stop shop for renewables. That has been done before for upstream oil industry. We can do it for RE. And thankfully, Senator Win Gatchalian passed the EVOS law. We now have an online system, but much work needs to be done. Number 4, this was also alluded to by Eric. Let's simplify the rules for deployment of personnel, vessels, machinery, equipment, spare parts, and materials for RE. Now, this will definitely help develop all renewable energy power plants. And finally, let's have interagency issues being resolved by government, through a task force. All these hopefully will be put in place in the next administration so we can push for more RE. We're not lacking in any rules or programs. We have the net metering program. Next slide. We already have the renewable portfolio standards. Next slide. Both for on-grid and off-grid areas. We have the green energy option program. Next slide. All of which were passed during our time at the National Renewable Energy Board. And of course, we now have also very soon the renewable energy market rules, where RE certificates can be traded. And finally, the green energy auction program, which finally the DOE said will be converted into a FIT program. All these are in place, and we hope that we can do this energy transition and have more renewables in the energy mix. Back to you, Vic.
Thank you, Attorney Layug. We are now going to the questions and for you to answer those questions. We have prepared some questions, but I believe most of you have tackled some of them already. So we will start with Attorney Layug and then go to Attorney Mr. Francia and then Dr. Arcilia. Attorney Layug, you mentioned that we we experience a reversal of trend. Instead of having more capacity, RE capacity, it went down to 29%. So where did we go wrong? What happened? Even if you said that we had adopted a lot of policies like net metering, RPS, GEOP, and now we have future. In the future, we have the RE market.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Vic, the sudden halt in development of RE in the Philippines was primarily driven by the policy announced by the current administration, where they said we should be technology neutral. While I understand the driver behind that, which is cost, I've been saying ever since we should declare that our policy should be more pro renewables, because in fact, since 2010, the price of renewable energy plants, the prices have gone really so low. Where once upon a time, the fit for solar is 9.68 pesos per kilowatt hour. Now, power supply agreements now under solar are signed for 3 pesos 50 cents. So in fact, I've been saying that we can actually go for another round of fit price cap. And this definitely, such a program, will reverse this trend in having more coal and hopefully add more RE. Number two, repeatedly in all fora and webinars and Senate hearings and Congress hearings, to put up a power plant, you need 200 permits. Actually, that has been increased by a recent presentation by Senator Win Gatchalian. It became 300. 2 to 300 permits and signatures. It's like telling our investors we don't want them to build. So we need to do something about that. Those two resulted in a reversal, unfortunately. But we can always, there's always hope.
Vic, can I comment on that?
Okay, Mr. Francia.
Yeah, if I may, to be from where I sit, having been a relatively new player in 2011, frankly speaking, I don't think the country had much of a choice but to go down the path of building more thermal plants, much as we are very big proponents for sustainable and environmentally friendly power source. The pain point that we saw at that time was cost and reliability. When we started AC Energy in 2011, we had big aspirations of focusing on renewables, but we quickly realized it's not going to work because renewables was still very expensive at that point in time. As Jay said, it was close to 3 pesos per kilowatt hour for solar. And the country was growing at like close to 6% per annum in terms of energy demand. It was the boom years for economy. So we didn't have much of a choice. The alternative would have been natural gas, but at that time, the gas market wasn't as developed, wasn't as robust. You needed to sign 15, 20-year gas purchase agreements, which would have been a huge risk to the investor. No, it's a take or pay contract. It's only in the last 5 years that gas contracts are more flexible. You can buy spot market or shorter term contracts The market is so much more developed. And also in the last 5 years, it's also only the last 5 years when we saw that steep decline and renewables getting to grid parity. Now, and that's when we decided to make that pivot from relying on thermal as AC energy back in 2017, 2018. We decided to go big on renewables. Now, having said all that, moving forward, while again we would love to have renewables and storage as the main sources of growth, I fully support Jay's advocacy on renewable being the key policy of the government. We're being realistic. Now that coal arguably is out of the equation already for the right reasons, we believe that we need to complement this with other more reliable technologies like gas. It's going to take time for battery storage to really scale, and we really need to do a portfolio approach at least in the next decade. Hopefully, uh, you know, sooner rather than later, we will not have a need for other thermal technologies anymore. But right now, I think to be realistic, we need to continue relying on a mix of reasonable thermal gas and renewables and storage. The beauty of gas is that they are also able to complement the variability of renewables. Anyway,
Thank
hopefully
you.
that provides a balanced picture on the historical context.
Okay. Dr. Ursilia, would you like to comment on this uh, anomaly that was presented by uh, Attorney Layug, that instead of going having more RE, we reverse the trend? And where does nuclear come in?
Okay, first, again, I like Attorney Lai's comment and for being forthright and candid on this. So, so we first, I totally agree that renewables are important, but I happen to also agree with Mr. Francia that we have to be realistic. That renewables, if you look at that, 50%, we're still 50% dependent on coal. And we cannot rely on renewables now for baseline, a baseload. That has to be faced. That's why, I, there is no escaping that natural gas will have to come in because simply you cannot just not everything can be on renewables. You need without the batteries, you need a backup power supply, and that happens to be coal. Now, one quick comment: the coal plants are aging; they don't last 20, 30 years. Nuclear power plants are lasting now up to 80 years. So again, actually, I am surprised that Ayala is not considering nuclear, since America has 100 nuclear power plants, and actually, you know, the BNPP, for example, can be revived in 5 years. I mean, you know, there are three working models of the BNPP: Slovenia, Brazil, and Korea. They've been operating for 40 years. Their power cost is a fraction of what they have. So I cannot understand why you will not consider nuclear when it is clean. Of course, there's an issue of waste disposal, but I believe we can dispose of the waste safely with our geothermal technology, our deep boreholes. But if we don't consider nuclear in the equation and we take coal out, there's just no way that you can escape the fact that the electricity price will increase because we have to import the replacement for Manampaya natural gas. And that's the that's so to me it's irresponsible not to consider nuclear as a possibility. And then there's a technology called small modular reactors, 30 megawatts, especially for the islands that are not in the grid. That's where the most expensive powers are because they are not grid. And then you can have SMRs or small modular reactors that can supply the fuel there. Now, are nuclear plants safe? Of course, if you compare the safety, but then the problem is that if there's an accident, of course, it's you know it's broadcast. But we have studied, for example, Fukushima and Chernobyl, and we have very good reason that they can be avoided. But this is it. If we don't consider nuclear in the equation, as Mr. Francia said, And then Jay Layuga said, we are in for a big shock. It's not just Houston. I mean, it's mataas ng kuryente, mas mamahal pa yan. Thank you po.
Vic, can I add something there?
Go ahead, Jay.
Yeah. Thanks, Eric. I just wanted to supplement what Eric and Doc
Yes,
Aloy
sir.
said. No?
You
Just
said
to,
that we should consider. Oh, okay.
okay, I'll speak first. Just to clarify, Vic, no, when we push for renewables, we did not say we will replace the baseload plants. No, in fact, you in the data that I showed, Vic, no, I'm trying to recapture what once upon a time was already captured by renewables, no, which is 35%. We reached 40%, no, in terms of installed capacity or generation, no, in 2010, and now we're down to 20, no. So that's what I'm trying to capture back, no, and hopefully the DOE, no, with its target to amend the National Renewable Energy Program. In fact, the DOE will target 50% in the installed capacity energy mix of the Philippines by 2040. It can be done. No, we're not saying we should replace base load. No, we all know that some RE plants cannot provide base load power. No, unless we build big hydro dams. No, or find more geothermal plants. No, but we want to capture again what we have already lost. No, and that's about 15% of RE that was once upon a time there in the energy mix.
Okay.
Yeah, Vic,
Mr. Francia?
if I may, yeah, I just wanted to respond to Doc Caloy's comment, no, why Ayala is not considering, or perhaps other companies as well, no, nuclear. I think there's a lot of uh, relevant issues, perception, community stakeholder management, and so forth. But I think the deal breaker, if you will, or the critical issue is risk management. As you mentioned, Dr. Loy, there's a lot of plants in the US, globally, France, etc., that have been operated very well and are safe, no incident, and so forth. Uh, However, I think it's the what if scenario. Um, if something goes wrong, it could be catastrophic. Not only in the community where the nuclear plant is, but also to the corporate sponsor. No, that I think that's the fear. It's the risk management factor. Whereas if it's a coal plant or a gas plant, something goes wrong. The worst case scenario arguably is manageable or less severe or catastrophic than nuclear. So I think that stigma, that fear, that risk is something that corporates are concerned about. No, so again, I'm not saying that that's the right answer. I mean, I take your point that there's a lot of pluses as well in terms of carbon emissions, cost, reliability, and so forth. I think it's that really is the what if black swan type scenario that people are saying. Dito na lang kami because it's the more viable worst case scenario alternative. No. So again, not saying it's a right or wrong answer, but I think that's where some corporates are coming from.
Yeah. Going back to what Dr. Asira said, that we should consider nuclear as a possibility. But where are we now as far as adopting nuclear energy? I understand that the policy has already been forwarded to the president.
I think Dr. Arcila is muted.
Yeah, thank you, Jay, and then Greg for the points there. Now, first, I'd like to say I am in total agreement with both of these guys. Okay, we should push for
Yeah.
renewables and not baseload. But for nuclear, last year the president created a nuclear energy program in interactive committee to study precisely the possibility of nuclear. And then, so it was multi-agency. We worked very hard from July to December to create what we call a national position, because we, if, and then to address also Mr. Francis' concern, we will not have nuclear unless it follows the safeguards and then security and safety tenets of the International Atomic Energy Agency. So we're following that. And the first thing, there's a national position. It's basically saying that the country is open to nuclear. That draft executive order was submitted to President Duterte in December. It hasn't been signed yet. Without that signature, we we will not go anywhere. So, but uh, but the fact that he opened that committee was one of the most important movements in nuclear since 1986. Okay, so but then let me just add one or two things on the safety issue. When Fukushima happened, the 450 nuclear plants in the world did a Fukushima stress test and said, how do we prevent this? And it is preventable. I mean, we don't have time to do this. For example, uh, just two facts: the magnitude 9 earthquake that happened in Fukushima has never happened in the Philippines. And then what did the Fukushima do is actually the tsunami that flooded their cooling systems, which is placed under in the basement. Proof of this is that there are four nuclear plants beside Fukushima that were not damaged because they had a higher elevation. BNPP is situated at 18 meters higher than than these plants. So I understand the risk, but also the point is that if we did go through this path, it will be done scientifically. I cannot also accept the reasoning that Filipinos are not capable I've heard comments. Hindi mo mga mapaandar yung trend mo, mag-ambition ka pa ng nuclear power plant. Okay. In my 3 years here, I realized that nuclear plants are actually simpler. A plane is more complicated. Okay. So sabi ko, sino nagme-maintain ng mga aeroplano natin, mga Filipino engineers? I'm not, and who, by the way, South Korea built 4 brand new nuclear plants in UAE, an oil-rich company. Many engineers in the Filipinos are involved. So yun po. So at least at the very least, at saka yung SMRs, that's why I wanted to have discussions. The stigma has happened because of Hollywood in nuclear. If they're only willing to listen to the developments, and then I think there's more to be had. Even on an accumulated time, mas maraming namamatay po sa ibang energy sources. And by the way, geothermal, I'm a geologist. I would love geothermal and hydro. As you know, we cannot increase this because geothermal, we have maxed out the big fields and the only discovery was small. And in hydro, we're archipelagic. You can only build so many dams. Thank you.
Doc Kaloy, let me ask you a question. Unless Vic is back. No,
Yeah.
Vic is back.
Yeah, I'm back.
Go ahead, Vic.
Please go
Okay.
ahead.
Now, Doc Kaloy, I'm sure many people will ask, in relation to nuclear. Have you done a study on more or less how much on a peso per kilowatt hour it would cost, no? And at what capacity? No, that's a big question mark because, as you know, it's not really for the government, no, to enter into PSAs, but really for the distribution utilities and the co-ops. No? So and there's a competitive selection process. So how will nuclear compete with gas and coal?
All right. Kasi I when I went to Crisco, we have only one model, the BNPP, okay, Bataan Nuclear Power Plant. I visited the Bataan Nuclear Power, the equivalent of BNPP in Slovenia. Okay, it's been operating 40 years. Their cost is about a tenth of what we have. Overall, if you had everything, it's about half. That's the thing that we have, at least half. I mean, even in importation costs, as I said, a BNPP, $20 million, 18 months, it will fit in a jeepney, it will fit in a C-130. So address your security concerns. If Indonesia starts clamping down our coal exports, the fuel of the BNPP will fit in a C-130. So that's the case. And then the thing too, the costing is actually on the SMRs. The problem there is that no models yet. But the SMRs will be ideal for the isolated items. Yun po. Yun yung quick answer. But you
Okay, Vic.
Yeah, let's move on to another topic. For Mr. Francia, where are we now as far as discovering new sources of renewable energy? The DOE previously mentioned about floating wind, floating solar. How viable is this in the Philippines? And is your company going to that direction? Is that an attractive investment for you?
Yeah, definitely these new emerging technologies should be looked at as an industry. You mentioned that we should not just focus on the traditional solar, wind, geothermal, hydro, and biomass. There are variants as well, as you very well mentioned. Floating solar is something that would really expand the potential capacity in the Philippines. There's a lot of potential. Laguna Lake, for example, is a great location for floating solar. We're aware of several companies that are developing floating solar, including ourselves. There's 90,000 hectares of water surface in Laguna Lake. It's roughly a one hectare to 1 megawatt. So you're not going to build 100% on the lake, but you can build I don't know, anywhere between 5 to 25%. That's significant. No, that's anywhere between 5,000 to 25,000 megawatts in theory. The limiting factor would be the transmission. Now, the good news about Laguna Lake is that it is almost at the center of the demand. It's in the demand or load center, as long as you can connect to the various substations, and you eliminate the need for those expensive. You relieve the pressure for NGCP to keep on building transmission lines, which, by the way, is a major issue that needs to be addressed as well due to right of way issues and so forth. But that's right for the picking. We're very hopeful that LLDA will finalize its policy and start issuing the water rights to the various developers. I think that's huge potential, and I think that can be a short to medium term solution. Those are projects that can be done in the next 2 to 3 years, depending on how fast we can get the permitting process going. But we're practically preparing for that. Um, Offshore wind is another thing that's much talked about lately. That's something that the industry players are also looking at. Although, to be quite frank, offshore wind is probably 5 to 10 years away in terms of the competitiveness of the technology, similar to battery storage. But definitely, since we're looking at a long-term horizon here, offshore wind is something that we should, as an industry, also take a look at. Beyond 10 years, as I mentioned, green hydrogen, I think it's still very early days. It's still expensive, but no doubt that is something that could take the trajectory of solar or battery storage, which is exponential decline in cost and increase in efficiency. So those are some of the emerging technologies that one should take a look at and incorporate into the mix. No? But I would also like to emphasize that all of this will require an upgrade of our grid. We can only do so much in terms of adding generation capacity, but we need the grid to be upgraded. I know that NGCP is prioritizing this, but there are challenges of right of way acquisitions. So I hope that there could be some improvement on that front as well. Vic?
Okay. Attorney Jay, Dayo, would you
Yeah.
like to comment on these emerging technologies?
Yes, Vic. In fact, if I may add, no, I'm helping the World Bank in drafting the offshore wind roadmap, no, for the Philippines. No, and there's so much potential. In fact, we are hoping that in about 5 years' time, offshore wind cost can also be coal parity. No, and therefore that can serve the base load requirements. No, as you know, in Europe, no, the offshore wind capacities are so huge. No? And they're very heavily reliable. No? So we're hoping that offshore wind can provide that additional capacity for RE in a much larger scale than what we see nowadays. On the floating solar, yes, I've also actually helped LLDA, draft the rules. Hopefully soon they will issue it. No, I fully support the initiative of Eric and Ayala and the other six developers. No, they want to put up solar plants in Laguna Lake, and based on my understanding, there's a potential of about 5,000 hectares, no, that can be used, no, in Laguna Lake, and that certainly can add up to our renewable energy target.
Yeah, and Vic, if I may add to that, if it's all right, I think we need to think big in terms of renewables, and these new technologies really have the potential to take the scale to a whole new different level. No, I mean the first batch of feed-in tariff plants, average size of 50, 100 megawatts. They're small. To give the folks here an idea of the magnitude of renewables that we need to build, assuming no nuclear scenario at least, no, the country will require anywhere between 800 to 1,000 megawatts of base load, conventional equivalent per year starting in 2023 if we are to uh, uh, address the growing demand, uh, the market. And if we overlay the second objective, which is DOE's objective of going back, as Jay mentions, going back to the 35% energy output from renewables by 2030, we're now back down to 21%. We want to go back to where we were before, which is closer to 35%. That would require, by our estimation, it's easy to do back of the envelope calculation here, that the incremental 8,000 megawatts, that's 1,000 over the next 8 years between 2023 and 2030. That's a total of roughly 8,000 megawatts, just to put it very simply. Half of that, or 4,000 megawatts of that, should come from renewables and equivalent, no? And that would bring renewables closer to 35%. Now, the catch is the capacity factor, the output of renewables, is not the same as coal or gas. So that you need to gross up. For you to produce 4,000 megawatts equivalent output, equivalent to that of a coal plant, you need to multiply that by roughly 3 to 4. Because as Dr. Arcia showed earlier, the capacity factor of solar and wind is very low, about sub 20% for solar and it's about 30% for wind. So you need to multiply that. So the rough estimation is we need to build, if it's mostly going to be solar and wind, and I agree with Dr. Arcilia that the opportunities in geothermal and hydro are few and far between. The big ones have already been developed. Then you really need to go heavy on solar and wind, including offshore wind, uh, 5, 10 years from now, and including floating solar, hopefully in the short term. We would need to build around 15 to 20,000 megawatts. That's about 2,000 megawatts per year starting in 2023. So the green auction that Jay referred to by DOE, that they're gonna shift to a feed-in tariff system, but albeit on an auction basis, on a bidding basis, we're looking at, well, DOE mentioned I think 2,000 megawatts, if I'm not mistaken, Jay, on the hopefully on the first round. That's good for 1 year. We should have that 2,000 megawatt every year now,
Every year.
whether it's an option every year. But basically, as an industry, we should be looking at 2,000 megawatts of renewables every year from 2023 to 2030. More better, more is better. But I think that target is a pretty realistic, stretch but realistic one. And then finally, I think we need to harmonize this with another important policy that Jay mentioned, which is the RPS, the Renewable Portfolio Standard, which stands at 1% annual increment. I think even NREB endorsed this already, that metric has to go up to 2.5 or a little higher than 2.5% to make sure that the renewable requirements will result in a 35% share of output. So I think we just have to harmonize the policies and just get going. But on the part of us as developers and investors, we are developing our pipeline as if all of these policies will happen. So we need to be prepared. Ayaw natin mapahiya na the government gets all of these policies, all of these auctions out there, and then hindi pala makaproduce yung industry. So we want to make sure that we will be prepared to deploy once the conditions are right.
Okay, we have questions
Thank
from our audience, and this is for Dr. Resnilia. Attorney Jay?
Yeah. Uh,
I think that was
Okay.
Doc.
How many years will it take to revive the country's yeah, how many years will it take to revive the country's nuclear energy program?
okay.
Or
Okay. First,
I
yeah.
think the question refers to the Bataan nuclear
Yeah.
power plant. Is it practical to revive the BNPP, or should we just build a new plant?
Okay, first regarding the Bataan nuclear power plant, you know, speaking of contentious things, uh, many people are not aware there are three working models of that operating exact same model in Slovenia, Brazil, and South Korea. South Korea's plant was the investment was recovered in 6 years, and South Korea has actually offered. There's a standing offer to South Korea to revive the BNPP for $1.2 billion. That could probably be, I mean the proposal is with the DOE. Now that $1.2 billion is the cost of a coal plant for the same output, and I've already shown you the you know the savings in importation and security for using nuclear. People have been talking about advances in technologies, and I respect that. But like for floating solar, remember we are the most typhoon-prone country in the world. 20 typhoons a year. You have to keep that in mind if you're going to, you know. I'm actually amazed at the fact that the risk people are saying they're considering wind and seaborne platforms for wind and solar. Uh, what's the risk of that with the typhoons coming in versus a nuclear plant? If you permit me just one shared, because it's I'll just show you one quick. Uh, Here is the here what I call the small modular reactors. This is the traditional NPP. This is a small modular reactor. Here, it can be put into a truck. This is about 50 megawatts, and it's modular, so which means that uh, you can actually uh, you can build this up as your demand goes higher. So I again, the debate has been on the 35%. There's no argument to that. Ang pag-uusapan natin, anong mangyayari doon sa 60% na kailangan natin? At saka, tataas ba talaga ang kuryente? Hindi. Especially when we import LNG. 10% ng ginagastos ng mga Pinoy sa kuryente. Tataas pa po yan. Yan po yung pinaka hello Houston. And in fact, that will be the welcoming match for the next administration. They have to really address this. Wala si Vic.
I think there's a delay.
Yeah.
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 So Jay, you have to take over hosting, no?
Okay.
So it's
All right.
quite, yeah, anyway, it's quite clear.
All right,
that
he's gone.
You maximize renewables. There's no debate about that. In whatever policies, whatever. But as Eric was also saying, you need to, because of the low capacity factor, you need to back it up. Right now,
Yeah.
it is coal that's backing up. Why
Yeah.
can't you have nuclear, especially the SMR or the LNG? At saka, let me ask you a question, guys. Tataas ba ang kuryente when Malampaya goes down?
I think that's a given, Doc Aloy, no?
Yeah, this is what I'm saying. That's why you have to tell this to the Filipino people. And that's why I really
Yeah.
admire you, Jay, for saying this. Because talaga mataas ang kuryente. And I can tell you,
Yeah.
definitely, nuclear is cheaper. Of course, the risks are there. But magpupustahan tayo, Eric, between your floating solar on the sea with that 20 typhoons versus nuclear plant na pwede mong i-crash land yung 747. Ay, naku.
Hello, good afternoon. Good afternoon po. Hello, I'm
Angelica's
Angelica.
here.
Yes
Yeah.
po.
Angelica, sorry, I just wanted to react to Dr. Arcilla. I think
Go ahead, sir.
I think if a lot of the local, I don't want to speak on behalf of other local conglomerates. They will have their own position on nuclear. Although I am listening to what you're hearing, I'm learning a lot. Want to keep this dialogue open. But I think if the Philippines makes it a policy to promote nuclear, I think the best bet in terms of a potential entry strategy for Philippines is to get foreign investors, because they are the ones who are, especially the incumbents, those who have experience and comfort in terms of investing in nuclear. I guess it's a risk of stating the obvious. No, I think those will be your best bet, at least in the beginning.
After Eric, just to answer the point, and Korea has started a nuclear program the same as us. They have 23 nuclear plants, and they built the best nuclear power plants, brand new in the UAE. You know, what does it tell us when the oil-rich countries, UAE is building nuclear plants, and Saudi Arabia is going to be building nuclear power plants? Yun po eh. I mean, so that just is telling us something.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess that's an angle that I'd be interested to hear. What are the um, international investors saying? I'm guessing that part of the process in terms of advocating for nuclear on your end, Dr. Arcilia, is not only talking to or influencing, advocating among the local players, which to me is a higher bar because we're all most of us are risk averse. Reputation risk being one top of mind. But I guess if an international company is used to doing nuclear, that would be, of course, the hurdle that they have to address is doing business in the Philippines, in the market, and so forth. But I'd be curious to hear what international investors in nuclear are saying about potentially entering the Philippines if the policy is.
Actually, I
And
told you there's a standing offer from Korea.
Hmm.
I
and
deal with
yeah,
it.
and Doc Aloy,
Okay.
there's
Um,
nothing that stops nuclear proponents, of course, to participate in the CSP, no, of Meralco.
Yeah.
No? Remember, recently there was a 1,800 megawatts competitive selection process. No, so nuclear is not being barred. No? So if they can compete in the CSP, and that's where Eric was saying, no, maybe the foreign proponents can go ahead and submit a proposal, no, and compete. Nothing will stop them anyway. No, it's not barred. It's
Yeah.
really, it boils down to price, no? At
No,
the end
no.
of the day.
Something will stop them, Jay. It's the national position. Without the national position policy from the government, we
Hmm.
cannot nuclear. Because I mean, by the way, we are the regulators, and we will not allow any because that's part of the milestone set by the IAEA. That's a big difference between your industries and nuclear. The
I
nuclear
see.
industry is very, very
Sir,
highly regulated, okay, internationally by IAEA. There's no international regulation for coal or natural gas.
Hmm.
okay, sir, maybe jumping off from our topic on renewables. By the way, I'm Angelica Yang, a multimedia reporter from Business World, covering energy and environment. So, how realistic would a nuclear program revival be?
Actually, not realistic if you ask me right now. Okay, that's why I'm focusing on nuclear medicine and nuclear agriculture. I feel sad because having known the potential in other countries, and especially the Filipinos want a lower price. And we've heard from everybody here that the price of electricity will still go higher. Okay, but it's not going to happen without strong political commitment. The national position has to be there, and Mr. Francis said probably it will be driven by private investment. The government cannot anymore afford to actually build new plants. The best it could do is to revive the BNPP, but it carries a lot of baggage. So uh, unless there's a very, very strong political will, it cannot happen. That's necessary.
All right. So we are almost at the end of our webinar. Maybe we would just like to ask for a few key takeaways. Maybe give 3 minutes per speaker for their key takeaways, which viewers and our readers can also take home with them after this webinar. Maybe we can start with you, Mr. Arcelia.
Okay, yeah. So first, I am for renewables, and I totally agree with my colleagues here that we should ramp up renewables 35%. But there's just 65% of the energy that we need, and then malampay is running out. So my message to kababayan, tataas po ang presyo ng kuryente natin. Make the government be clear on this and answerable kung bakit tataas. Kung kulang ang policy, dapat managot po. Kasi malaki ng paghihirap ng mga tao sa mahal na kuryente. Salamat po.
Okay. How about Mr. Francia for your closing remarks?
Yes, thank you, Angelica, Vic, and thank you to Business World for hosting this very important dialogue. Again, I think we are in the midst of a massive movement called energy transition. Again, emphasize on the word transition. It's not going to happen overnight. It's a long-term roadmap, uh, hopefully to a net zero world, and we all have to do our part. There are challenges. Obviously, renewables is big part of the answer, but not the silver bullet. So we have to look at other technologies as well, enabling technologies, battery storage, even natural gas. An open question on the nuclear policy of the government, um, but we need to resolve that as well because we have to have a harmonized approach. There's no one size fits all. So we at the private sector will continue to collaborate with our regulators and the government to make sure that there's an active so that again we're integrating government policy and uh, the respective investment initiatives that we have. Again, from on behalf of NC Energy, we are committed to renewables and the technologies and definitely help the country get to the target percent by 20. Thank you.
All right. How about for your closing remarks, Mr. Layog?
Thank you, Angelica. Again, thank you to Business World. And of course, always a pleasure chit chatting with Eric and Doc Aloy. We at the renewable energy sector, as you all know, we have been pushing hard the government to pursue reforms. I've always been of the belief, having come from government, that government must be an enabler. No, in other words, let's make sure that all these private sector investors, RE developers, um, be able to build power plants easily, with ease of doing business, without all the barriers. And I'm certain that if we remove all these barriers, we will have more renewables and capture the lost glory of RE. Again, in 2010, it was at almost 40%. We are now down to 20%. So I hope we build more capacities, and thank you to the private sector led by Ayala. They have been trying. It's not for lack of effort, but of course we need government to help them.
All right. So that concludes our webinar. Many thanks to our speakers for sharing your insights. So once again, thank you to Dr. Arcelia, Mr. Francia, and Attorney Layog. Much gratitude also to our partner organizations, British Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines, Bank Marketing Association of the Philippines, Management Association of the Philippines, Philippine Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and to our media partner, the Philippine Star. And of course, to everyone who joined us today. Be sure to tune in to Business World social media pages to be updated on our next projects. Again, this is Angelica Yang, and this has been Business World Insights. Good afternoon.